Welcome to the show, Timmy. How are you doing on this fine Wednesday morning?
Not too bad at all, mate. Just got a bit of study done in the morning and I'm ready to record this now.
Excellent. How did you like our little performance in the South Coast FIFA Pro Clubs comp we have running last night?
Look, mate, I was really impressed with what I saw. I was a bit surprised, actually, at how well we defended, considering how bad we were the week before. So, yeah, very happy to see 6 points on the board from last night.
Yeah, awesome. So for those who haven't heard, we in our FIFA Pro Clubs competition we have running locally, we are raising money for the Black Dog Institute during this competition that we have running with Jaden and Blake from Oak Flats as well. Teams are donating a certain amount of money for every goal they score, and some teams are also donating money for every goal they concede as well, which is really generous of them. Originally, we began as the only team that was donating. However, that quickly changed, and we now have 13 teams on board in our donation drive. Last week, in the first week, the competition raised a pledged amount of $479, and I'm proud to announce, Tim, that after raising $546 from all the goals last night, the competition now has cracked the $1,000 mark, and the total pledged donation amount now sits at $1,025. How good is that, Timmy?
Yeah, look, it's really good to see so many people getting involved. I think to see this kind of genuine kindness from people who are involved in this competition is fantastic and bring on more goals.
Now, Timmy, we have an extremely special guest today, don't we?
Indeed, we do.
So our guest today, he needs no introduction, but we thought we'd do him the honour of giving him one anyway. So he's commentated every single A-League Grand Final that I've been able to watch or be able to remember to watch, has travelled with the Socceroos all over the world, and in that time has been to the World Cup, the Asian Cup, World Cup qualifiers, and countless friendlies. He was the voice behind the mic when Australia booked its ticket to Germany 2006 on the most famous night in Australian football history, and he's known, at least to me, as the voice of Australian football. It's our pleasure to welcome to the South Coast Footballholics podcast, Simon Hill. Simon, welcome along, and thanks for coming on to a little podcast like ours.
Nice to be with you guys. My pleasure. Hope you're both well.
You too, mate. How's your life changed since football stopped? What have you been doing to keep yourself busy?
Yeah, it's been tough. Same for a lot of people, I imagine. Just trying to keep fit, keep healthy, and keep busy. Really, which is difficult. Obviously, with no live football, but there's still stats to be kept up with, and books to be read, and podcasts to take part in. And, so you get through the days, but we're all in the same boat, aren't we? Everybody's going through the same experience. We just want the football back, basically.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And over the last few weeks, it seems more and more likely that football will eventually return at some point this year.
Well, you certainly hope so. The latest rumour is that maybe August the 1st is going to be the date when we'll resume, with the teams going back into training in July. But that's yet to be confirmed officially. It's all just speculation at the moment. Of course, there needs to be a negotiation, with the clubs and the players, most of whom are, of course, going to be out of contract at the end of May or June. So they would need to have their deals extended or some extraordinary short-term deal agreed. And also there's the broadcaster as well. So I think there's a lot to resolve. But at the end of the day, and we hear, Rugby League says it's coming back on May the 28th, and AFL saying it's not going to be too far behind. Well, all the sports can say what they want. If the government and the authorities say you can't play because it's not safe, then nobody will be playing. So I actually think football in this regard has probably got it right in terms of, just holding its horses for the time being and taking best advice from the government, because, they're, at the end of the day, they're the people who will decide whether sport gets played or not.
Yeah, it's exactly right. Timmy, we did discuss in one of our original first podcasts that the FFA has been quite productive in dealing with coronavirus, hasn't it, Tim?
Yeah, look, I think that's something that they needed to do, is be proactive in this kind of a situation. I think we've seen in other parts of the world, it perhaps, governments haven't been and governing bodies of sport haven't been, and issues have sort of occurred from that. So I think it's really good to see, our governing body being proactive in this situation, and it's good to see that they're taking an active role in trying to get football back this year.
Now, in this podcast today, we're going to be diving into Simon's life as a football fan growing up in Manchester, his life as a football commentator, and many other topics as well. But we'll start off with his life as a football fan. Now, as most people know, Simon is a diehard Manchester City supporter. But what I want to point out is the little Bermuda Triangle, as such, we've got going on over here in this podcast, because today we have a Manchester City fan, a Manchester United fan, and a Liverpool fan having a civilised conversation. I don't think this has ever happened before, Simon.
but which one of the three of us is from Manchester or Liverpool?
Exactly right. Exactly right. Now, speaking of your allegiance with Manchester City, your allegiance with Manchester City dates back to before you were even born. In fact, I believe in the late 1800s, your great-grandfather, a man by the name of Fred Taylor, played for Manchester City, or Ardwick FC, as they were known back in the day, in the late 1800s. So I'm guessing you had no choice but to support the blue side of Manchester, Simon.
Yeah, look, it's a family thing with me. It is for many people who grow up in Manchester. You know, you're either sort of red or blue, really. So my great grandfather, as you rightly point out, a guy called Freddie Taylor, played for Ardwick FC in, I think it's 1892 or 1893. Now, Ardwick FC were the forerunners of Manchester City FC. They became Manchester City in 1894. I can't actually find any historical record of Fred Taylor playing for Ardwick FC, but I had a photograph many, many years ago, which sadly has been lost in the mists of time, that my nana owned, and had him in the kit with the big handlebar moustache and the baggy shorts and the hobnail boots. So he definitely played for them. And yeah, that's where it all started. Really, my granddad was a City fan all his life. He passed away many years ago, and my dad still goes. He's just this year, because he's 85 now. He's just this year given up his season ticket because he's struggling a little bit health wise. But he's been a City fan all his life, so obviously, I had no choice but to follow into that as well. So as soon as I was old enough to know what football was, I was enrolled as a junior blue, the Junior Manchester City Supporters Club, and went to my first game aged 6, and that was it, basically. You're given your club, you don't choose it. It's handed down like a family heirloom.
That's exactly right. So tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up in England and being a supporter of a club like Manchester City, going to games every week and experiencing that. It must have been really cool.
Well, I didn't know any different. My dad took me to my first game in 1974, which is a long time before you two guys were even thought of. And I remember the first game, I didn't really know what was going on because I was only probably 5 or 6 years old. But there must have been something about it I liked, because when the next home game came along, my dad asked me, do you want to go again? And I said yes. And by then I was just that little bit older and, understood perhaps a bit more. And I was hooked. Going to Main Road every Saturday or every other Saturday, being part of big, noisy crowds, and learning about not just football, but the players that I loved, such as Colin Bell and Peter Barnes and Dennis Chewett and Asa Hartford. Learning about the other teams, which included your two teams, Liverpool, Manchester United, all the players from those eras: Steve Highway, Kevin Keegan, Ray Clements, Stuart Pearson, Stuart Houston, Martin Buchan. These are all the names from my childhood that I grew up, and you sort of absorb all this like a sponge when you're a kid. And then, slightly later, I went to my first European tie involving City, and that was different again. Under floodlights, City played Juventus in 1976, 77, and you start learning about other countries and other countries' teams and other countries' players. So, football, I think, even at a very early age, was a big life learning experience, and that's continued throughout my entire life with the amount of countries I've been privileged enough to be able to visit through football. And that's one of the reasons I love the game so much, because it's such a global game, but it's not just about the football; it's about all these different cultures. And we have a connection as human beings. It's our universal language. We might not speak the same lingo, but our shared love across the planet is football, and that's why I love it so much. Why else would I be, in a country as far away as Australia? That's because of football. Um, Not that I wouldn't have wanted to come to Australia anyway, but it was football that was the vehicle. So it's I've been very fortunate. It's given me absolutely everything in my life, everything.
And we've been very fortunate to listen to you in every single big game over our childhood growing up.
Yeah, well, that's been my good fortune that I was in the right place at the right time to be selected to be the commentator for some of those big games. The World Cup in 2006, the qualifier against Uruguay, the Asian Cup in 2015, and grand finals, a lot of internationals in between and tournaments too. And I timed my arrival to Australia, not that I knew this at the time, in 2003, right at the moment when the game was ready for liftoff. So, I was very lucky, and I've just been fortunate enough to be in situ for all of those games. And, hopefully if I brought them to the Australian public in a nice and engaging and entertaining way, then job done.
You sure have. Now, I'm sure, as being a Manchester City fan, over the years you've been to some extraordinary games, but tell us what it was like to be there on the day when City won the league title in 2012 when they beat QPR. Even as a Liverpool fan, that is honestly one of my favourite Premier League games of all time. But to be there and witness it would have been absolutely incredible.
Yeah, it was. It was probably both the best and the worst day of my life all wrapped up in one. Because for 93 minutes and whatever seconds it was horrible. I remember sat high up I think I was in the Colin Bell stand, almost level with where Sergio Aguero scored that winner, incidentally, although I was very high up in the gods. And before that moment happened, I remember thinking, I don't know whether I'm ever going to really get over this. I don't know how I'm going to be able to talk to people tomorrow. I think Peter Drury comes up with a famous line during his commentary where he says, where will they go? How will they get up in the morning? Where will they find the moral fibre to go to work and face their colleagues? And that's exactly how I was feeling. I just thought the world was going to end because everything was in our hands and it looked as though we'd blown it. But as we all know now, it turned around in the space of a couple of minutes. And I don't know whether obviously I was ecstatic, but I think I was just stunned and emotionally drained as much as anything else. People always say, oh, you must have had a massive night that night. To be honest, I had a couple of beers and went back home. I think I was just exhausted with it all. So, but a wonderful time. Obviously, the first time City had won the league championship in my lifetime. It wasn't the first trophy we'd won in my lifetime. I was there in 2011 the year before when we won the FA Cup against Stoke. And if you ask me, a favourite memory, really, it's probably the semi-final against United of that year, because that was the big turning point. We'd been underdogs in Manchester and therefore underdogs overall because United were the best team in the country for many, many years. And to finally win a big game against them, particularly a cup semi-final, that was very special. But they've given me some great moments over the last few years, which I think is payback for the 35 years of crap that they gave me before. So I think I've earned it.
Yeah, it's a bit shameful that I've seen Manchester City win more titles than Liverpool in my lifetime, but I've listened to many interviews about yourself surrounding how much you enjoyed going to Main Road back in the day to watch City. Obviously, City's enduring a lot of success right now, but how much do you miss those days, going to Main Road, watching all the games? Because that was quite a football stadium, that place.
It was. I do miss Main Road. I miss Main Road a lot. It was a huge chunk of my childhood. And while I love the Etihad Stadium, it's a beautiful construction. It doesn't have the same vibe, the same buzz, the same crackling atmosphere that Main Road used to be able to provide, particularly in the days of the big open terrace. Well, it had a roof on, but the Kipak stand, which I used to go and stand in, week in, week out, and on big games, it was a sight to behold. So I do miss it. I strangely enough miss the days when City were a very different club to what they are now. And don't get me wrong, I wouldn't swap the trophies. I wouldn't change what we have now for what we had then. But I think something's been missed, and this is an overall comment on football. We've moved to all-seater stadiums. We've moved to a very corporate experience of football now, and I think we've lost something in that process. The essence of proper football atmosphere, which I grew up with and enjoyed week in, week out. And yes, there were unsavoury elements to that at times, particularly in the mid-80s. There was football violence, there was trouble, not nearly as much as people will have you believe, incidentally. I went to thousands of games and never got in any bother. But I think we've lost a little bit of the essence of the game, and I do miss that. I miss, strangely enough, the times when City were crap, because there was a certain gallows humour that we had, and a camaraderie, and an almost sheer bloody mindedness about City fans, of which I was one, to say, no matter how bad it gets, I will still be there. And there was a real enjoyment and kindred spirit type feel about that. So that's gone, but it swings and roundabouts. It's been replaced by something wonderful in many ways. Aguero, De Bruyne, David Silva, Vincent Kompany. Who wouldn't enjoy watching those players running around in your team's jersey? Of course, I love those players, but I'm still a little bit nostalgic for what went by. But maybe that's my age as much as anything else.
Oh no, I completely get it as well. Like you see it, like even as young as we are, we've seen it over our lifetimes as well. Which it is a bit sad, but at the same time, look, you get to witness, like you said, some amazing players, like the players you just stated. Even as a Liverpool fan as well, I remember watching all those Champions League nights back in the mid 2000s. Obviously, they won the Champions League in 2005, but we didn't exactly have a team as good as what we do now, in my opinion, obviously. But yeah, you look at some games like the Chelsea semi-final in 2005, and that atmosphere was just electric. And there's sometimes when I'm watching games at Anfield, and it seems like you can hear a pin drop. But yeah, that's unfortunately, football's changed it a little bit in that way. Some places, and when they want to, though, they have a fantastic atmosphere. Now, moving on now, we're going to be chatting a little bit about your life as a football commentator. So I believe you started all the way back in the media, back in England as a copywriter?
Yeah, look, I did a postgrad course in newspaper journalism in Portsmouth on the south coast of England, which is where I was a student for 4 years. So my ambition really, probably still is, it was to be a football writer. I had no interest in being a broadcaster whatsoever. That only came later and purely by chance, really. So I started off when I was doing my journalism course, writing match reports on the Portsmouth youth team for the local paper there, which was the Portsmouth Evening News. So that was my first sort of little break into journalism. And the broadcasting only came about because at the time I graduated, which was 1991, the UK was going through a really tough recession, and there weren't an awful lot of jobs anywhere, let alone in journalism, for a young kid who'd only just graduated. So I was looking around for a job, and there was nothing in written journalism, and I applied really in desperation for a job in commercial production for a local radio station in South Wales called Red Dragon FM. And commercial production was basically writing adverts for the station, scripting the adverts. And I thought, well, all right, it's not journalism, but it's maybe as close to it as I'm going to get at the moment with the situation. I got a letter back from Red Dragon saying, "Thanks for your application. We don't think you're quite suitable for this role, but we have a job that's just come up as a sports reporter. If we see your brief experience in written sports journalism, would you be interested in having a go for the sports reporter's job?" So of course, that was my dream. So I applied for it without a second's hesitation, and I was fortunate enough to get it. And there we go. My career sort of took a slightly different path, and I was into radio, where I stayed for many, many years, moved to the BBC, and then started doing a bit of television at the BBC. And your career sort of develops from there on in. So I think as with a lot of people, you have a certain idea in mind as to where you want to go, and sometimes you have to take a slight tangent, and that's what happened to me through no choice of my own. Really, it was just circumstance and opportunity.
Yeah, wow. Timmy, you got a couple of questions for Simon.
Yeah, so obviously you currently work for Fox Sports, one of the biggest sports media organizations in the country. What's it like working for an organization that has such a big viewership, and does that at all change the way you prepare for commentaries and other things you do with them?
Look, I've worked for the BBC, I've worked for ITV, worked for Sky in the UK, worked for SBS over here. So Fox is, in a similar mold to all of those that I've just mentioned. I don't know whether I changed my preparations. I mean, my preparations for a commentary are a pretty well established, routine now, because I've been doing it since 1993 was my first commentary. So you sort of get into a bit of a groove as to how to prepare for a game. Obviously, you're mindful that you're broadcasting to a large audience, and obviously some audiences are larger than others depending on the scale of the game. But what you're trying to do is just get across, the context of what you're watching. I liken it to being a driver of a car with a wonky wheel, and it keeps trying to veer off to one side of the road and the other. And your job as a commentator, and the car in this analogy is, of course, the football game. You're trying to keep steering it back towards the middle, keeping it on an even keel, and keeping people at home informed and hopefully entertained as to what's going on. So you're constantly evaluating and assessing and trying to put into context a live event that is unfolding and occurring in 1,000 different ways, and you've got to be ready for everything. You've got to have done your research, which I always try and do as meticulously as possible, and just be ready for every single scenario that may come your way.
Yeah, so further to that, in terms of your preparation, what does that sort of entail? And would you say that, is it down to purely just describing the game on the day, or would you say the utilization of facts and statistics throughout the game is just as important?
Look, it's all those things. I wouldn't quite use the word description, because in television, people can see what's going on. Description is a good moniker for radio, because obviously people don't have the gift of being able to see the players on the pitch when you're calling a game on radio, which I did for many years. But on television, people can see the pictures, so you're probably complementing the pictures. Obviously, you're calling the players' names, identifying them, which people need to know at home. But you're sort of adding to what people can see. Now, that can be facts, it can be statistics, it can also be observations based upon your experience of the game, which I've watched a lot of football over 30 years. You can be asking questions to draw that information out of your co-commentator, who is normally the ex-player, a Robbie Slater or a Ned Zelic or an Andy Harper. So they've got that technical knowledge of what they're watching. And it's an overall package, basically, to try and enhance the viewer's experience of what they're seeing. And as I say, hopefully make it not only more informative, but by extension, more entertaining as well.
Now, I read an article about an interview you did with Lucy Zelic on, I believe it was SBS The World Game a while back.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
The call you had it was about the call you had for the Australia versus Uruguay game back in 2005. From what I read, the game wasn't exactly your most favourite call because of the jet lag after returning from Montevideo and the fact that you thought it was quite a messy call at the time.
Yeah, it's not one of my favourite calls. It's a strange one because obviously the way the result went, it's probably most football fans' favourite game, or at least close to it. But from a professional point of view, that was a difficult night for me. I was jet lagged. I'd been in Montevideo just 3 or 4 days earlier, along with the players, so I was tired. There was obviously a huge audience watching it, so it was quite a stressful broadcast as well because you wanted to get it right. And on top of that, unfortunately, I had Craig Foster, who was so horribly emotionally invested in the game um, that at times his professionalism went out to the window a little bit. I think at one point I had to sort of hold his hands to stop him clapping a decent Australian pass. And obviously, as people remember, when the winning penalty went in, he was just yelping random names into the microphone. So that all made my job as a caller very difficult. And I do remember, the next morning thinking, oh dear, I think we're going to get smashed for that call. Now, as it's turned out, we haven't. And people love it, which is great because they remember it in context with the emotions that they felt because Australia won. And those are the sort of the fine margins of being a sports broadcaster. You can be swept along in a successful moment and be revered for something that technically probably wasn't very good because you were part of something that people remember in a very fond way. But I always think, had that result gone Uruguay's way, and it could have so easily done, in the penalty shootout, had Uruguay won that shootout, would that call have been remembered as fondly? I don't think so. So, you're sort of tied up in the emotion of the occasion, and you have to sort of remember that. And as it's turned out for Craig and I, as the years have gone by, we've been associated in a very positive way with that game, which is wonderful. And I wouldn't not want to be associated with it in that way. But from a purely professional point of view, and I think people who work in broadcasting would probably agree with me if they listened to that call critically, it wasn't the best.
Yeah, despite this, how crazy was it to be the man behind the microphone when Aloisi netted that penalty against Uruguay to send us to the World Cup? It must have been pretty surreal.
Yeah, again, I think I was, more concerned professionally as to whether I'd captured the moment properly, which hopefully I did. I still listen back to that call. I'm forced to listen back to it because it's replayed so many times, and there's 100 things I'd change about it. But yeah, it's a brilliant moment to be involved in some small way. I mean, I did the easy bit really. I just called the name and the goal. Johnny Aloisi and Mark Schwarzer and the rest of the team had the tricky bit to do. But it's lovely to be involved with, and something very nice to be associated with and look back on. And it's strange, every radio interview I do that talks about reminiscing about my career, that's always up near the top. And yet for me, it's just not really a fond memory apart from the result.
Of course, of course. Now, obviously, including that game, you've been lucky enough to call some huge and memorable games for Australia. One of which is their game against Japan in Kaiserslautern back in 2006. Is that your favourite game that you've called?
Yeah, certainly in Australia, yes. I was a lot happier with that call. I thought, I nailed the big moments a little bit better than I had done against Uruguay. And obviously that was, in many ways, even more important than the Uruguay game because it gave the nation not only their first ever goal at a World Cup finals, but also our first ever win. So that was very special. And I think the sight of, so many Australians inside the Fritz Walter Stadion, where I was as well, is something that will live with me for a long time because a few years earlier, I think my first home game that I called for Australia was against Turkey in Sydney. And there were 28,000 people inside the ground. And I think only about 2,000 were wearing green and gold. The rest were cheering on Turkey. And I remember saying to Craig Foster, where on earth are the Australian fans? And he sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, this is football in Australia. And yet 2 years later, there we were with thousands of Aussies cheering on the national team at a World Cup in Kaiserslautern. So yeah, that whole World Cup was very, very special. And I would say that game, out of all the games I've called in my time in Australia, that would be the favourite. I don't know about overall. There's, earlier on in my career back in the UK, there were some very special games as well. But in Australian terms, yeah, that'd be it.
What was that day like? Do you vividly remember much about it?
Yeah, I remember it being very hot. I remember getting very out of breath climbing up the steep Betzenberg Hill, which is where the ground is located. It's right on top of a huge hill. I remember calling back to Australia to speak to my wife and asking her where she was, because she was at a very noisy sounding venue, and she said, I'm actually at a fan fest in Sydney. And I said, oh, right, sounds a bit noisy there. Are there a few people there? And she said, yeah, there's about 5,000 people here, and it's 2 o'clock in the morning. And I remember thinking, wow, that sort of hits home just how big this is, and how much pressure was on my shoulders in many ways, because I had to call the game, and I flew solo that day as well. But yeah, it's a lot of very nice memories of that particular day. And then I remember as well, at the final whistle, I went down to do the press conference that I had to do, and being lifted off the ground in a big bear hug by Stuart Hodge, who was then the FFA press officer. Everybody was just so delighted that Australia had, achieved history. And it seemed in those days as though, they were doing it virtually on a month by month basis. Every game seemed to bring, some new achievement. So there were very happy times to be involved with football in Australia.
Oh, that's unbelievable. That's fantastic. Now, you touched on some of the Premier League games you've had the pleasure of covering. Can you tell us some of your favourite games from the Premier League that you've covered in England?
Well, both of you guys will appreciate this one. I think probably the biggest game I did in England was Manchester United against Liverpool at Old Trafford many, many years ago. This is during my days as a radio caller for the BBC Radio 5 Live. And I shared commentary with Alan Green, who a lot of people may know. Worked with a lot of the top broadcasters in the UK, Mike Ingham, John Murray, Peter Drury, John Champion, Martin Tyler as well. So, they were great days, and that'd probably be a game that would sort of stick out as being a big one. But I also called an FA Cup final during my days for the World Service. Again, Manchester United, Liverpool, 95, 96. Those two teams seem to have followed me around a bit. Calling games at Main Road, which I did on several occasions, was a very, very special, but also rather odd experience, because I never really felt as though my place at Main Road was in the commentary box. It should really be in the stands. And lots of other games, visiting all the big stadiums, Highbury, the Stadium of Light, Anfield, Old Trafford, Villa Park. I did all those big venues. And in fact, my very first game, which again is something that sort of sticks out, because a lot of commentators start by doing smaller games. My very first commentary, would you believe, was Chelsea against Blackburn at Stamford Bridge in the Premier League.
Oh, wow.
So that's one that stands out. I remember being as nervous as hell before that one. So yeah, happy days, lots of great memories, and I've been very fortunate to have experienced so many of them.
Geez, you've been able to develop under the best with Peter Drury and Martin Tyler. That would have been unbelievable to learn off those two.
Well, Peter was my and is my era. We're the same age, so we all grew up together. Martin obviously is a bit older, but Peter, John Champion, Guy Mowbray, Steve Wilson, all the guys that you will hear calling the Premier League at the moment in England, they're all my generation, and we all grew up together. And I'm lucky enough to count some of them as my friends. So the guys that we learned off, really, certainly Martin Tyler would be one. But the generation that we learned off was the likes of John Motson, Barry Davis, Brian Moore. You might not be as familiar with some of these names. Peter Jones, Brian Butler was my commentary hero. So I'm talking, 1970s here. But yeah, all of those guys that you mentioned who are operating at the moment are very, very good callers, real masters of their craft.
Yeah, that's of course they are. Yeah, we have the pleasure of listening to both yourself and all those characters week in, week out. Of course, when football goes back. Timmy, you've got another question.
Yeah, look, I just think so. You were speaking about how perhaps the Uruguay call wasn't one of your favourite ones from a professional perspective. So I guess my question is regarding: do you sort of need to separate your emotions in the game from your professional job in order to be a successful commentator?
Always. Always. And this is why I said before, just a moment or so ago, that I used to find it very difficult and awkward calling games at Main Road because obviously I was emotionally invested in my team. And therefore, even though I tried to be as professional as I could possibly be whilst doing the call, and I hope and trust that I was, but you're always left open to interpretation when your colours have been so firmly nailed to the mast as mine were and are with Manchester City. Now, in terms of the Australian national team, look, of course I want the national team to do well. I've lived here for many years. I'm very emotionally invested in the game here. But when it comes to calling games, you have to put that to one side. And my having come from another country, I think actually probably helps that a little bit in terms of the national team, because I am a little bit more dispassionate. And for you watching at home, and you say, oh, what was it like? It was that brilliant moment when Australia qualified. Of course, you're saying that as Australians who, lived that moment as fans, and that's brilliant. For me, I had to separate myself from that, and it was easier to do that because I wasn't born here. So you always, as a caller, have to put any sort of allegiance to one side. And I'm fortunate in that regard because every single game in Australia that I call, and I know we're accused of bias left, right, and centre, it's complete hogwash. The only team that I support, I assure you, is Manchester City. And therefore, calling games in Australia is pretty straightforward for me in terms of allegiance because I don't have any.
Yeah, so I guess moving on in terms of, I was actually at this game, the 2015 Asian Cup final between Australia and South Korea. Obviously a late winner in extra time there. What was that experience like for you as a commentator? Obviously, you've spoken about separating your professional capacity from your emotional capacity. So how was that for you?
Yeah, that was another very high profile occasion. I remember that our producer came in pre-game and sort of gave me and Andy Harper a little bit of a rev up and said, don't worry about being unemotional. Get involved in it. It's a massive game for the country. And when I look back on that game, I think maybe I got a little bit too emotionally involved in the contest. It was gripping, but again, I think as a caller, you have to try and remain as dispassionate as you possibly can because you're not just commentating for Australian fans. You have to remember that. You might be commentating to some people who, for whatever reason, don't necessarily want Australia to win, or people who are not necessarily football fans. So you always have to remember the full breadth of your audience. And I think maybe I got a little bit too emotionally involved in that game, but for understandable reasons, it was a very tense game. A very important game, obviously, for the national team, and as it turned out, a very emotional occasion as they won, a major trophy for the first time. So it's a fond memory, but if I had my time again, I'd probably do it a little bit differently. That's not to say I look back on it in the same way as I do the Uruguay game and think, oh, that wasn't great. I think the call was fine. But I would approach it in a slightly different way if I had my time over again.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it was incredible to listen to some of your experiences as a commentator and as a fan, which it's quite, we could honestly listen to you all day. It's It's incredible some of the stories you have. But moving on now, we're actually going to have, talking about separating emotions, we're going to have a little chat about Australian football in general. Obviously, you grew up watching English football, and when you originally moved out to Australia, did it shock you a little bit when you went from watching the leagues like English Premier League to, watching the old NSL, the A-League these days? Did that shock you a little bit?
Well, I moved out in 2003, which was at the tail end of the penultimate NSL season. And I immediately, of course, being football mad, uh, tried to immerse myself in the local football culture. So I travelled all over Sydney watching teams like Northern Spirits. I went to Parramatta Power, Sydney United, Sydney Olympic, Marconi Stallions. Went to all of those grounds and watched the NSL. And look, I knew it was going to be different. Of course, I knew that. I wasn't stupid. I knew it wasn't going to be, packed stadiums with wall-to-wall coverage, the same as what I was used to in England with the Premier League. But I think what shocked me more than anything else was not the apathy, but the antipathy towards the game here. Um, people didn't just not care about it; they were actively hostile towards it. I remember when I moved my belongings over from the UK. Of course, they had to come over on the boat, so they arrived a couple of months after I did. And when the container finally arrived, I got a removal company to come and bring my stuff to the flat where I was living. And the guys who were unpacking the boxes, and I had a lot of football books, still do, of course. It's part of my job, research, etc. So as they were unpacking these books, this removal guy said to me, "Geez, mate, you got a lot of soccer books." And I said, "Yeah, it's my job." And he said, "Game for puffs." I said, "Sorry?" "Game for pufters, mate." I said, "When I want your opinion, I'll ask for it, thanks. Now just continue, with your job." So, this was very much a part of my experience when I first moved to Australia. And I remember thinking, why is there such hostility towards a sport? It's a game. But it was almost like it was cultural warfare. And, that still exists today. It's not quite as bad as it was when I first arrived. I think we made a lot of progress, but there's an awful lot of hostility towards football for no apparent reason that I can see, other than that it poses a threat to Aussie rules and rugby league. And I think there are a lot of vested interests that are wrapped up in those games, and obviously that's why that hostility still exists. But it's become our cause célèbre. We have to fight that because otherwise we'll make no progress.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, Timmy and I'm sure we can relate to the hostility you're talking about because Tim, especially growing up, going to school with a lot of rugby league players and stuff like that, we'd cop a little bit of that flack that Simon got.
Yeah, look, no, definitely. When he was speaking about there, I was thinking about, especially in primary school, it was always about, rugby league, and there was barely any talk about football as a sport, and I would definitely say over the years that we've seen a bit of an increase in football being a sport that people, is popular with people. And it's just interesting seeing that, it has changed. And hostility, I think there is still a fair bit of it. But yeah, it's interesting to see how that's evolved over my lifetime.
Well, enough chat about AFL and rugby league, of course. So we'll move on to chatting about our game in this country, of course. So I'm sure we've all heard the thousands of opinions as to what needs to be done to improve football in this country. However, Simon, we would like to know a couple of your opinions on the matter, if you don't mind. First one, I'll ask him for myself. Do you believe that we need a national second division, and do you reckon it'd be possible, sustainable? What's your opinion on that?
Yes, we do need a national second division as soon as possible because I think the game requires it here for many reasons. I think it needs more opportunities for young players to play professional football at a national level. So that's the first thing. I think the game needs it in terms of generating interest, to be honest. We've got an 11-team A-League to become 12 next year when MacArthur join up. That's great. But I think we need ultimately promotion and relegation. I think that's the big game changer for sport in this country, not just football. It's something the other codes don't have. It'll be our point of difference. Imagine those, relegation battles going to the final day, and the same for promotion or playoff finals. That it has to happen. Can it happen? Yeah, it's tricky. I mean, Australia's got some pretty big challenges in terms of its geography, in terms of the fact that most of the finances go to the other codes. So we've got to fight for it. But I actually think that this, COVID break represents a great chance for people to reassess and reboot this game. Because if we're being brutally honest, the last 3 years have not been great. We've been mired in governance politics. Interest has waned. There's not been proper investment, in my opinion, in the promotion and marketing of the A League. So it needs a fresh approach. It needs a plan, a proper strategy. And I trust the game's leaders are at this very moment coming up with those solutions because, to be honest, we need it. We've got this huge player base that we bang on about endlessly, 2 million players. If we can connect just more than a fraction of those players to the A League and a second division, the sky's the limit. We've only just begun to scratch the surface of the potential of the game here in Australia, but we've got to get cracking. We've got to stop arguing and rowing with each other, and we've got to work together, get things moving, get a plan together, be bold, believe in this game. It's the best game in the world. There's a reason why this game is played in 200 plus countries and Aussie rules and rugby league is only played in one or two. They're not as good games as ours. So the sooner we get this sorted, the better. And we can start to tap into this huge potential.
I think you've hit it smack bang on the head there. That's I agree 100%. Another point I make about the elite player positions and pathways available. I remember I was watching the roundtable talk about the state of football from the golden generation, which was a week or so back. At one point they made was the amount of elite player positions available in the old NSL days as opposed to now with A-League clubs. I believe they said the elite player positions available in NSL development programs was an extra 600 or so players compared to the A-League clubs development, bearing in mind that Western United don't have a youth academy yet. So, as you said, that's a massive talking point and a massive point in Australian football that we need to address.
Well, look, it is. But to be fair, the caveat to that is, okay, there might have been 600 more places with the NSL, but there weren't any fully professional pathways at the end of it. Now, the A-League does provide that. So, it swings and roundabouts. What happened when the A-League started, as I'm sure you remember, is that we built from the top down, probably because we had to, because these clubs, franchises were new. And we were starting basically from ground zero. So, the introduction of academies and those development pathways has taken probably longer than we wanted. There's no doubt about that. They should have come in earlier, but they didn't for whatever reason. Now it's a time to build on that, to get more professional clubs in so we can extend those pathways. There is no doubt that youth development needs to be looked at. But if I could just make this point, I think we spend an awful lot of time talking about youth development without making the link as to why we find it so difficult to construct things like academies. And the reason is the clubs don't have a lot of money. Why don't they have a lot of money? Because the TV deals aren't as big as the other codes, and because people still don't turn up in significant enough numbers to watch and support their clubs. We've got millions of players, more than enough. We've got millions of coaches, more than enough. What we don't have still is enough spectators, paying spectators. That's what we have to build. Build the supporter culture, which provides the money through gate revenues and bigger attendances, which leads to bigger sponsorships, advertising, and bigger TV deals, and provides the money, the finance, to implement those sorts of initiatives like academies and youth development pathways. So we constantly miss this connection. everybody wants better things done with youth development, me included. Youth development, we bang on about it all the time. Who's paying? Where does the money come from? The money has to come from, in part, okay, government. Yes, we need to do better on that front as well. But the clubs can only do it if they can afford it. And that means building a football culture, a fan culture around these clubs to support that financially at the gate. And that leads on to other things like bigger TV deals.
Yeah, just I guess that fan culture you were talking about, that links a fair bit. If we get a second division somehow, like there's teams talking about, like teams in the talk, if we do form a second division like the Melbourne Knights, your South Melbournes, these are clubs that are 60, 70 years old and they've got rich history and they already have a fan base of sorts. So if that second division does come in, maybe that fan culture could improve drastically.
Well, look, maybe. And, there's no doubt that I think having some of those former NSL clubs in competing with current A-League clubs might be a good thing. It would certainly bring the two eras together. Of course, what we have to avoid is what happens towards the end of the old NSL with those storied clubs who are fantastic in terms of developing players and winning trophies, but their crowds dwindled. And, there's a lot of historical revisionism with regards to crowds in the NSL. I was at the Melbourne Knights last year doing an FFA Cup tie there, and there were a couple of guys, and they were reminiscing about the old days, which was great. And they said, "Oh, this place was full, 15,000 every week." Well, it wasn't. Not a lot of history books are lying. Most weeks it'd be lucky if it was 2,000-3,000. So, we have to be careful not to get wrapped up in misty-eyed nostalgia and believe that the past was a better place than it was. The NSL died for a reason. The A-League is here for a reason. By and large, the A-League has done a lot better. It's got some problems at the moment. Maybe it's time to bring the two eras together and bring the best of the old to ally with the best of the new and hopefully make something better at the end of it.
Yeah, of course. That's 100% spot on, I think. Now, to finish off the episode, we're just going to have a little trivial question for you. Out of all so we're chatting about Australian football and the professional game in this country. What is some of your favourite A-League games that you called over your time? Is it the grand finals? Is it derbies, Melbourne derbies, Sydney derbies? What are some of your favourite games?
Oh, probably a long list. I mean, right at the top, you'd probably say the Brisbane Roar Central Coast Mariners grand final, 2011. That epic game that Brisbane clawed it back from 2-0 down to win on penalties after Partalu's last-minute equaliser in extra time. That's a very big memory that stands out. Similarly, Adelaide's win over Western Sydney in 2016, the Isaias free kick, "Si, senor, si," I think was my line, which I don't mind that one. That was a great atmosphere that day. So grand finals do stand out. There are others, big games, derbies. I remember a derby between Western Sydney and Sydney FC at the old Parramatta Stadium. I think Kerem Bullitt scored and the flares went off and the noise was just deafening. I remember thinking, God, this is like being in Europe. It was just sensational, the whole ground was full and jumping. I wish we could go back to those days. Melbourne derbies. I think that there are so many down the years because I must have called thousands, really. I'd have to really try and sit down and think about a top five. But grand finals and derbies and big blues, they'd all be up there.
Of course. Well, Simon, it's been absolutely fantastic to have you on. I honestly still can't believe that you actually read my message. You got my message somehow. It was a little bit of a shot in the dark, that one. But look, we appreciate you supporting a little local podcast like ours. Obviously, we're two uni students. So the fact that we got such a big football figure like yourself on this show, it's immensely appreciative. So thank you very much for coming on.
My pleasure, guys. It's always a pleasure to talk football. Just try stop me when I start. That's the problem.
Exactly right. Timmy, well done today, mate.
Cheers. Thank you.
Awesome. We'll see you later on the week. Thanks, everyone, for listening and stay tuned for next week.